The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched before Ambassador Elena Vasquez, like a vast cathedral made of metal and light. Hundreds of seats rose in curved rows around the central floor, each designed for a different alien species. Some seats were filled with water for the fish-like Aquarians. Others glowed with heat for the rock creatures called Molten Ones. The air itself was carefully mixed to keep everyone breathing. Elena sat in the small human section, looking tiny compared to the massive aliens around her. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her dark blue uniform bore no decorations. She looked like what she was, a career diplomat who had spent 40 years learning how to talk instead of fight. But today, talking might not be enough. The chamber buzzed with nervous energy. 12 different alien species had gathered to decide humanity's fate. For 3 long years, they had been debating whether humans were too dangerous to remain free in the galaxy. The humans had won a war, yes, but they had won it in a way that scared everyone else. The session will now begin, announced Chairman Veltos, a tall crystal being whose body caught the light like a living diamond. His voice echoed through the chamber in perfect galactic standard, the common language all species used for official business. Elena folded her hands in her lap and waited. She had been waiting for 3 years. The first to speak was Ambassador Zixhai of the Collective, a creature that looked like a giant praying mantis made of silver metal. When it spoke, its words came from a translator box because its real voice was just clicking sounds. Honored Council, the translator said, we gather today to address the human problem. 3 years ago, these beings from the Sol system entered our space uninvited. They claim they came to help, but their actions were pure violence. They destroyed ships, killed soldiers, and showed no respect for proper procedure. Elena kept her face calm, but inside she felt old anger stirring. Proper procedure. That was what they called it when the hegemony enslaved entire worlds while the council filled out forms and held meetings. The humans fought without permission, Zixhai continued. They ignored our commands to stop. They refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to care more about alien refugees than their own lives. This is not normal behavior for an intelligent species. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Elena noticed which species nodded and which stayed silent. The Ascended, who looked like tall humans made of glowing mist, whispered among themselves. The hegemony representative, a massive creature covered in tentacles, shifted in its special pool with what might have been satisfaction. Next came Ambassador Thys of the Zephyrians, another crystal being but smaller and more delicate than the chairman. Her voice was like wind chimes when she spoke. The human military doctrine is deeply troubling, Thys said. Our analysis shows they have an abnormal willingness to sacrifice themselves for others. In the Battle of Kepler Station, a human ship rammed itself into a hegemony cruiser to save a refugee transport. The ship's crew of 200 died to save 300 aliens they had never met. This is not logical behavior. Elena remembered reading the report about Kepler Station. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been 28 years old. She had a daughter back on Earth who would never see her mother again. But Sarah had seen the refugee ship full of families and made her choice in 3 seconds. The council called it illogical. Elena called it heroic. Furthermore, Thys continued, humans show dangerous emotional responses in combat. They become angry when they see suffering. They take unnecessary risks to help wounded enemies. They refuse to retreat when retreat would save lives. These behaviors make them unpredictable partners in any future conflicts. The Ascended representative floated forward next. It was called Unity, and it spoke for thousands of minds linked together into one consciousness. When it talked, its voice had a strange echo, like many people speaking at once. The human concept of individual worth is primitive, Unity said. They assign equal value to all conscious beings regardless of species, intelligence level, or social contribution. This leads to inefficient resource allocation and poor strategic decisions. During the Outer Rim campaign, they spent more medical supplies saving wounded hegemony soldiers than they used on their own troops. Elena's aide, James, was a young man fresh from Earth's diplomatic academy. She could see his hands clenched into fists under the table. She touched his arm gently, warning him to stay calm. Getting angry now would only prove their point. The parade of accusations continued for hours. Each species took their turn explaining why humans were too dangerous to trust. They spoke of human irrationality and emotional instability. They worried about human interference in what they called internal affairs of sovereign systems. What they really meant was slavery. The hegemony had been enslaving smaller species for decades, and the Council had done nothing but send strongly worded letters. When humanity finally said enough and sent ships to stop it, everyone got upset about proper procedure. Ambassador Korvash of the Thermal Collective spoke next. His people were living rocks who thought very slowly and carefully about everything. Humans act too quickly, he rumbled, his words taking long pauses between each one. They see problem. They act immediately. No consultation. No committee review. No impact studies. This is chaotic behavior that threatens galactic stability. Elena almost smiled at that. Yes, humans acted quickly when children were being sold in slave markets. They didn't form committees to study whether slavery was bad. The worst moment came when the hegemony representative was invited to speak. Elena had fought hard to keep them out of these proceedings, but the council said everyone deserved to be heard. The massive tentacled creature pulled itself to the speaking platform with wet, sucking sounds. The humans call us slavers, it said through its translator. But they do not understand our culture. The species we employ are given food, shelter, and purpose. Many are too primitive to govern themselves. We provide structure and meaning to their lives. Elena's jaw tightened. She had seen the structure and meaning in the hegemony camps. Families torn apart, children worked to death in mines, adults beaten for speaking their own languages. The humans destroyed our ships and freed our workers without permission, the hegemony continued. Then they refused to return them to us. They claimed these beings wanted freedom. But how can a primitive species understand such complex concepts? The humans imposed their own cultural values on situations they did not comprehend. That drew more nods from the council. Cultural relativity was very important to them. They believed every species had the right to their own customs, even if those customs included owning other species. As the day wore on, Elena began to understand that this was not really a trial. The decision had already been made. The vote counts were already settled. This was just a show, a way for the council to make themselves feel better about what they were going to do. James slid a tablet across to her, showing the preliminary vote counts. Quarantine humanity to the Sol system, 9 votes. Allow humanity to remain free, 2 votes. Abstain, 1 vote. Elena looked at the numbers and felt something cold settle in her stomach. They were going to lock humanity away like dangerous animals, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The session ended with Chairman Veltos announcing that formal voting would begin tomorrow. Elena gathered her papers and stood to leave, feeling the weight of her entire species' future on her shoulders. As she walked through the corridors of the council station, aliens stepped aside to let her pass. Some looked at her with fear, others with pity. A few young ones looked curious, as if wondering what made humans so different. Elena had one night to find an answer to that question. One night to find a way to save her people from a cage made of fear and misunderstanding. She had been a diplomat for 40 years, but tomorrow she might need to be something else entirely. Elena sat alone in her quarters aboard the council station, staring at reports she had read 100 times before. The lights were dimmed to Earth normal, and the air recycler hummed quietly in the background. Outside her small window, stars wheeled slowly as the massive station rotated. She could not sleep. Tomorrow would bring the final vote, and she already knew how it would end. But tonight she needed to remember why it mattered. The first file she opened was labeled Kepler 442 Refugee Crisis. The pictures were 3 years old, but they still made her chest tight with anger. Thousands of alien families crowded into makeshift camps on a barren moon. Most were Zephyrians, the same crystal beings who now sat in judgment of humanity. The hegemony had invaded their home world with typical efficiency. They took the adults for labor and left the children and elderly to die. The Zephyrian government had fled to their colony worlds and asked the Galactic Council for help. The council had formed a committee. Elena scrolled through months of meeting minutes. Subcommittee reports on appropriate intervention protocols, debates about respecting sovereignty and avoiding escalation, impact studies and cultural assessments. While the council talked, 10,000 Zephyrian children had starved to death waiting for help that never came. The human colony ship Determination had been nearby when the distress signal started. Captain Maria Santos was supposed to deliver supplies to human settlements in the Outer Rim. Instead, she loaded her ship with food and medical supplies and headed straight for Kepler 442. The Council had ordered her to stop. They said she was interfering in matters beyond human authority. Maria had turned off her radio and kept flying. Elena opened the next file, combat footage from the Determination security cameras. She watched Maria's crew working around the clock to help alien refugees who looked nothing like them and spoke languages they did not understand. The humans shared their own food when supplies ran low. They gave up their beds to injured Zephyrians. They worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then got up and worked some more. When the hegemony ships finally arrived to finish their cleanup operation, Maria had refused to leave. She had 800 refugees aboard and nowhere safe to take them. The hegemony demanded she surrender the stolen property or be destroyed. Elena had memorized Maria's final transmission. "This is Captain Santos of the UES Determination. I have families aboard this ship who have done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you want them, you'll have to go through me." The Determination lasted 18 minutes against 3 hegemony cruisers. Maria died at her post, shields down and engines failing, still trying to get her refugees to safety. Her last act was to ram her dying ship into the lead cruiser's engine bay, buying time for the refugee pods to escape. 200 humans died that day. 312 aliens lived. The Council called it an illegal intervention and a tragic waste of life. The hegemony called it terrorism. Elena called it the moment she understood what made humans different. She opened another file. Lieutenant David Chen's mission report from the ground battle of Arcturus Prime. Chen's squad had been ordered to destroy a hegemony supply depot and withdraw immediately. Simple smash and grab operation. But when they reached the depot, they found it was built on top of a prison camp. 3,000 aliens from a dozen different species were trapped underground, working as slave labor to build weapons for their captors. Chen's orders were clear: destroy the depot and leave. The slaves were not his mission. Freeing them would take hours they did not have and risk his entire squad. The smart military decision was to call for backup and wait for proper authorization. Chen had been a smart soldier for 8 years, but that day he decided to be something else. Elena read his report with tears in her eyes. Chen had split his squad, half to destroy the depot, half to free the slaves. When hegemony reinforcements arrived, he sent his people to safety with the rescued prisoners and stayed behind to slow the enemy down. They found his body 3 days later, surrounded by empty ammunition clips and 14 dead hegemony soldiers. He had held a narrow tunnel for 6 hours against impossible odds, buying time for 3,000 people to escape. The Veltar, representative who had spoken against humanity, yesterday owed his life to David Chen. Elena had seen him in the footage, a young Veltar male carrying his injured daughter. Through the tunnels, while Chen's squad covered their retreat, now that same Veltar sat in the council chamber and called human behavior emotionally unstable. Elena opened file after file, each one telling the same story. Humans who threw away military doctrine to save alien lives. Humans who ignored orders to help enemy wounded. Humans who chose the hard right over the easy wrong. Again and again and again. The Battle of New Geneva, where Sergeant Lisa Park had crawled through enemy fire for 2 hours to reach a crash-descended transport. She died pulling unconscious aliens from the wreckage one by one, until a sniper finally brought her down. The Ascended she saved now spoke in the council about human, primitive emotional responses. The siege of Hope Station, where Commander Jack Williams had surrendered his ship to prevent the hegemony from bombing a civilian hospital. He spent 8 months in a prison camp being tortured for information he would never give. The civilians he saved were molten ones, the same species that now voted to quarantine humanity. The rescue at Proxima Delta, where the entire crew of the medical ship Mercy had volunteered for a suicide mission to evacuate a plague-infected colony. They had saved 12,000 collective drones before the ship's reactor failed. The collective now claimed humans were too unpredictable to trust. Elena's door chimed softly. James entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. Real Earth coffee, not the synthetic stuff the replicators made. Couldn't sleep either, he said, setting a cup beside her. Been reading the casualty reports again? Elena nodded, accepting the warm cup gratefully. 43,000 human dead in the Outer Rim campaign. We saved approximately 2 million alien civilians and freed another 800,000 from slavery. And tomorrow they vote to lock us away for it, James said bitterly. They're afraid, Elena said quietly. Not of our weapons or our ships. They're afraid of what we represent, James frowned. Which is what? Elena gestured at the files covering her desk. A reminder of what they used to be. Every species in that chamber was once like us, James. Young and idealistic and willing to fight for strangers. But the galaxy is old and tired. It's easier to form committees than to take action. Safer to study problems than to solve them. She picked up a photo from her desk. Her granddaughter Sarah, named after Captain Santos. The little girl was 7 years old and wanted to be a starship captain when she grew up. By tomorrow, that dream might be illegal. The Zephyrians used to be explorers, Elena continued. They mapped half the galaxy and helped dozens of primitive species develop technology. Now they won't act without 17 different impact studies. The Ascended were individuals once, each one unique and creative. They chose to merge into a collective consciousness because it was more efficient. No more messy emotions or difficult decisions. The Veltar were warriors who protected the weak. Now they calculate acceptable loss ratios before engaging any enemy. Elena sipped her coffee and stared out at the stars. One by one, they all chose safety over principle, procedure over action. They became civilized. And they hate us because we remind them what they gave up, James said. No, Elena said softly. They hate us because we remind them what they could still choose to be. She closed the files and leaned back in her chair. Tomorrow would bring speeches about human unpredictability and emotional instability. There would be votes and procedures and official declarations. The decision was already made. But Elena was beginning to think the decision that mattered would not be made by the council at all. She thought about Maria Santos, who had turned off her radio rather than abandon refugees, about David Chen, who had chosen 3,000 strangers over his own safety, about all the humans who had looked at an unjust galaxy and decided to make it better, one impossible choice at a time. The council could vote to quarantine humanity. They could build walls around the Sol system and declare Earth too dangerous for civilized contact. But they could not unwrite the stories of human courage that had already spread across the galaxy. Young aliens had heard about the humans who died for strangers. Some of them were asking uncomfortable questions about their own societies. Some of them were wondering why their leaders had let the hegemony operate for so long. Some of them were looking at the human example and thinking maybe there was another way to live. Elena finished her coffee and prepared for bed. Tomorrow she would sit in that chamber one last time and watch her species be judged by beings who had forgotten how to be brave. But the galaxy would remember, and someday, when the council's walls crumbled and their procedures failed them, they might remember too. The vote tomorrow would end the peace talks. But the real war, the war for the soul of galactic civilization, was just beginning. The council chamber felt different on the final day. The air was thick with tension, and the whispered conversations of aliens who knew they were about to make history. Elena took her seat in the human section, noting how many of the other species avoided looking at her directly. Chairman Veltos called the session to order with his crystal voice ringing through the vast space. Today we conclude the proceedings against the Terran Federation. Before the final vote, we will hear closing statements from selected representatives. Elena had not been selected to speak. That honor went to the same aliens who had spent 3 years painting humanity as dangerous savages. Ambassador Zixhai of the Collective spoke first, its metal body gleaming under the chamber lights. Honored Council, the evidence is clear. Humans cannot be trusted to follow galactic law. They act on emotion rather than logic. They ignore proper authority when it conflicts with their primitive moral code. The translator made Zixhai sound calm and reasonable, but Elena could see the angry twitching of its antenna. The Collective had lost 3 hive ships to human forces during the war, and they took their losses personally. In the Battle of Titan 7, Zixhai continued, human forces were ordered to withdraw by Council peacekeepers. They refused. Instead, they continued fighting to protect a group of primitive natives who were not even Council members. 60 human soldiers died for aliens who contribute nothing to galactic civilization. Elena remembered Titan 7. The primitive natives were a farming people who had just discovered electricity. The hegemony wanted their world for its mineral wealth, and did not care about the 3 million people living there. The humans had been outnumbered 10 to 1, But they held the line until reinforcements arrived. The council called it insubordination. The farmers called it salvation. Next came Ambassador Thys of the Zephyrians, her crystalline form shimmering as she moved to the podium. Elena watched this creature speak against humanity and felt sick. Thys herself was a refugee, one of thousands saved by human intervention. The human military operates without proper oversight, Thys said, her voice like wind through crystal caves. They make battlefield decisions based on personal feelings rather than strategic analysis. During the liberation of Kepler Station, they diverted medical supplies to treat enemy wounded instead of prioritizing their own casualties. Elena's aide James whispered quietly, her own sister was one of those wounded enemies they treated. That was the bitter irony of these proceedings. Half the aliens condemning humanity owed their lives to human sacrifice, but gratitude was a dangerous emotion in galactic politics. It implied debt, and debt implied obligation. The ascended representative unity floated forward next, its misty form rippling with inner light. When it spoke, the voices of thousands merged into one eerie harmony. Humans suffer from excessive individualism, Unity declared. They refuse to accept that some losses are statistically necessary for the greater good. In the Outer Rim campaign, they wasted enormous resources saving small groups of civilians when those same resources could have been used to end the war faster. Elena had heard this argument before. The Ascended believed in perfect efficiency. Save the most people with the least effort. Let a few thousand die here to save a few million there. It was logical, mathematical, and utterly without humanity. The humans had taken a different approach. Save everyone you can reach. Fight for every life, no matter how small or seemingly unimportant. It was inefficient and costly and completely human. Ambassador Korvash of the Thermal Collective rumbled to the podium next, his rocky body moving slowly but deliberately. Humans act too quickly, he said, each word taking several seconds to form. They see injustice and respond immediately. No planning, no consultation, no consideration of long-term consequences. Elena almost laughed at that. The Thermal Collective took 3 years to decide what to have for lunch. By their standards, anything faster than geological time was reckless haste. When the hegemony began its expansion, Korvash continued, the proper response was careful study and measured diplomacy. The humans sent warships. This shows a fundamental inability to work within civilized frameworks. The careful study had lasted 5 years. The measured diplomacy had produced strongly worded letters and economic sanctions that the hegemony ignored. Meanwhile, 12 different species had been enslaved and their homeworld stripped of resources. Elena looked around the chamber and saw the faces of beings who preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. They would rather study slavery than end it. They would rather form committees than save lives. They had built a perfect bureaucracy that could debate anything and accomplish nothing. The worst moment came when Chairman Veltos announced the next speaker. The council recognizes Ambassador Thulmago of the hegemony. Elena's hands clenched into fists as the massive tentacled creature pulled itself to the podium. This was pure humiliation, letting the slavers themselves speak against those who had freed their victims. Thulmagot's voice was like oil sliding over glass as it spoke through its translator. Honored Council, the humans accuse us of slavery, but they misunderstand our relationship with our workers. We provide structure and purpose to species that cannot govern themselves. Elena had seen hegemony structure firsthand. Children separated from parents and sold to different masters. Workers beaten for speaking their native languages. Entire cultures erased to make more efficient labor units. The humans destroyed our facilities and freed our workers without permission, Thulmago continued. They claimed these beings wanted freedom, but freedom is a complex concept that requires advanced intellectual development. Many species are simply not capable of self-governance. That drew nods of agreement from several council members. The idea that some species were naturally suited for slavery was surprisingly popular among beings who considered themselves enlightened. Furthermore, the hegemony ambassador said, the humans showed no respect for our cultural practices. They imposed their own values on our traditional social structures. This kind of cultural imperialism threatens the diversity that makes our galaxy great. Elena bit her tongue to keep from screaming. Cultural imperialism. They were calling the abolition of slavery cultural imperialism. and the council was listening respectfully, as if there were two equally valid sides to the question of whether people should be property. The final insult came when Thulmagot made its formal request. The hegemony asks that humanity's military be disbanded and their territory restricted. They have proven incapable of respecting the sovereignty of other systems. Their soldiers should be re-educated in proper conflict resolution before being allowed to serve again. Re-educated. Elena knew what that meant in hegemony terms. Broken and rebuilt until they would follow orders without question. Until they would watch slavery happen and file proper reports instead of taking action. Around the chamber, aliens whispered among themselves. Some looked satisfied, others uncomfortable. A few young ones looked confused, as if they were hearing things that did not match what they had been taught about justice and freedom. Elena watched the vote tallies update on the display screens. Quarantine 10 votes. Opposition 2 votes. The decision was final before the debate even ended. As Thulmagot returned to its place, Elena felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was not justice. This was not even politics. This was fear dressed up as wisdom, cowardice disguised as prudence. They were going to lock humanity away because human courage made them uncomfortable. They were going to side with slavers because fighting slavery was too much trouble. They were going to call it peace while they built walls around the one species that had reminded them what real peace looked like. Chairman Veltos rose to announce the final vote. His crystal body caught the light as he spoke in his perfect, emotionless voice. The council has heard all testimony. We will now proceed to formal voting on Resolution 2387. Restriction of Terran Federation expansion and limitation of human military operations. Elena had been a diplomat for 40 years. She had learned to sit quietly and let others speak. She had mastered the art of compromise and the skill of finding middle ground. She believed in working within the system, following procedures, respecting authority. But as she watched the galaxy's most powerful beings prepare to reward evil and punish good, Elena realized that some systems were not worth preserving. Some procedures were obstacles to justice rather than paths to it. Some authority was not worthy of respect. The vote began with the collective. The collective votes in favor of Resolution 2387. Elena felt the weight of her entire species' future pressing down on her shoulders. In a few minutes, humanity would be caged like dangerous animals. Their children would grow up trapped in one small system, while the galaxy forgot the lessons of human courage. The Zephyrians voted next. Zephyr votes in favor. Elena thought about all the humans who had died saving Zephyrian refugees. She thought about Captain Santos, who had given her life for people who now wanted to lock her species away. She thought about her granddaughter Sarah, whose dreams of exploring the stars would die in this chamber. The Ascended vote in favor. Elena stood up. It was such a simple action, but it cut through the formal proceedings like a knife. The chairman stopped speaking. The chamber fell silent. Every alien eye turned to look at the small human woman who had dared to interrupt. The silence in the council chamber was absolute. Elena could hear the soft hum of life support systems and the distant vibration of the station's rotation. 12 different species, representing billions of beings across the galaxy, stared at her in shock. For 3 years, she had sat quietly in her assigned seat. She had listened to accusations and insults without response. She had followed every rule, respected every procedure, and accepted every humiliation with diplomatic grace. Not anymore. Chairman Veltos recovered first, his crystalline form shifting to catch the light as he spoke. Ambassador Vasquez, you are out of order. Please return to your seat immediately. Elena did not move. She stood straight and calm, her hands at her sides, her voice steady when she spoke. Honored Chairman, I request permission to address the council before the final vote. Permission denied, Veltos said sharply. The human delegation was not selected for closing statements. You will resume your seat or be removed from the chamber. Then remove me, Elena said quietly. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the chamber, aliens shifted uncomfortably. This was not how things were supposed to work. Procedures existed for a reason. Order had to be maintained. But Elena was done following procedures that protected evil and punished good. I have something to show you, she said, reaching into her jacket. Something you need to see before you make this vote final. Security guards began moving toward her position, but Chairman Veltos held up a crystal hand to stop them. Elena could see the calculation in his faceted eyes. She was one small human woman surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy. What harm could she possibly do? Elena pulled out a small data crystal and held it up where everyone could see. This contains complete records from the Outer Rim campaign. Not the edited summaries you've been reviewing. The full uncut footage from our soldiers' combat recorders. Irrelevant, Veltos said. The Council has reviewed all necessary documentation. No, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. You've reviewed reports written by committees. You've seen statistics compiled by analysts. You've heard testimony from officials who were never on the battlefield, but you haven't seen the truth. She activated her wrist communicator and the chamber's central holographic display flickered to life. You want to know what makes humans dangerous? Let me show you. The first image appeared. A human medic named Sarah Kim kneeling beside a wounded Zephyrian child in the ruins of a bombed city. The little one's crystal body was cracked and bleeding, its light fading fast. Sarah was crying as she worked, her hands shaking as she tried to apply human medical techniques to alien anatomy she barely understood. This is from the Siege of Crystal Falls, Elena said, her voice echoing in the silent chamber. Petty Officer Kim had been fighting for 18 hours straight. She had no training in Zephyrian biology, but when she found this child in the rubble, she worked for 4 hours to save its life. The hologram showed Sarah using her own blood for an emergency transfusion, not knowing if human blood would help or hurt. It showed her holding the child through the night, singing earth lullabies to comfort a being from another world. The child lived, Elena said. Its name is Thaisala. It's sitting in the gallery right now, watching you vote to quarantine the species that saved its life. Elena looked directly at Ambassador Thys, whose crystalline form had gone very still. Thys knew that child. Everyone in the Zephyrian delegation knew what humans had done for their people. The image changed. Now it showed Marines from the 3rd Assault Battalion carrying wounded collective drones through enemy fire. The drones were heavy, each one weighed twice as much as a human, but the Marines refused to leave them behind. Battle of Drone Hive Alpha 7, Elena said. The collective had written off these drones as acceptable losses. But Sergeant Rodriguez's squad spent 6 hours fighting their way back to drag every wounded drone to safety. 3 Marines died in that action. They died for beings they had never met, who couldn't even speak their language. Ambassador Zixhai's antennae were twitching frantically. Those had been its drones. Its children, by collective standards. The humans had saved them when their own people had given up. More images flashed across the display. A human ship captain ramming his vessel into a hegemony cruiser to save a transport full of alien refugees. A human doctor working herself to death, treating patients from 6 different species during a plague outbreak. A squad of human soldiers forming a protective circle around enemy wounded, refusing to let hegemony forces execute their own deserters. You call us emotionally unstable, Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. You say we're too dangerous to trust. But every image you're seeing shows humans dying to protect aliens who meant nothing to them except they were alive and needed help. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Even the whispered conversations had stopped. Elena could see faces in the gallery, young aliens of every species watching the display with wide eyes and growing understanding. You want to know what makes us dangerous? Elena continued. It's not our weapons. Our ships are good, but not the best. It's not our tactics. Most of you have been fighting wars longer than our species has existed. It's not even our technology. We learned most of what we know from you. She gestured to the images still cycling on the display. Humans sacrificing themselves for aliens. Humans crying over alien dead. Humans choosing the hard path simply because it was right. What makes us dangerous is that we remember something you've all forgotten. We remember that civilization isn't about efficiency or stability, or following proper procedures. Civilization is about the moment when someone with power chooses to protect someone without it, regardless of the cost. Elena's eyes swept the chamber, meeting each representative's gaze in turn. You've spent 3 years calling us primitive and emotional, but I've read the histories of your species. You were all like us once, she pointed to the Zephyrian section. Your people once traveled the galaxy helping primitive species develop technology. You built schools and hospitals on 100 worlds. When did you stop? She turned to the collective. Your ancestors were individuals who chose to work together for the common good. When did cooperation become absorption? When did unity become uniformity? Her gaze fell on the ascended delegation. You were explorers and artists and dreamers. You created beauty that inspired entire civilizations. When did you decide that efficiency mattered more than wonder? Elena's voice never rose, never became angry or pleading. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found the words she needed to say. One by one, you all made the same choice. You chose safety over courage. You chose procedure over action. You chose being comfortable over being right. And now you're so afraid of what you've become that you want to quarantine the one species that reminds you what you used to be. The holographic display had changed again. Now it showed the aftermath of human victories. Not parades or celebrations, but humans working to rebuild what war had destroyed. They were teaching alien children, helping former slaves learn to read, sharing food with refugees who had once been their enemies. The hegemony tells you we're cultural imperialists, Elena said. They say we impose our values on others. But look at what we actually do. We don't make aliens become human. We help them become free. We don't destroy their cultures. We give them the chance to choose their own futures. She looked directly at the hegemony representative, who had been uncharacteristically silent during her speech. You call slavery a cultural practice that deserves respect. We call it an abomination that deserves resistance. If that makes us dangerous to you, then we accept that judgment gladly. Elena reached into her jacket again and pulled out another data crystal. This contains testimony from every alien species we've helped. Freed slaves describing their treatment, refugees explaining what human aid meant to their families, soldiers from your own militaries describing how humans fought and died beside them. She held up the crystal where everyone could see it. I could play it for you, but I don't think I need to. You all know what it would say. You know what humans have done and why they did it. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the vast chamber. You can vote to quarantine us. You can build walls around Earth and pretend we don't exist. You can tell yourselves that you're protecting galactic stability and maintaining proper order. She paused, letting her words sink in. But every young alien in this galaxy will know what really happened here. They'll know that when one species stood up to slavery and oppression, the Great Galactic Council chose to punish them for it. They'll know that their leaders valued procedure over justice and comfort over courage. Elena looked up at the gallery, where hundreds of young aliens sat in rapt attention, and some of them might start asking why. The silence stretched on for long moments. Then slowly, someone in the gallery began to stand. It was a young Zephyrian, probably the child Sarah Kim had saved, now grown to adolescence. Then another alien stood, and another. Within minutes, half the gallery was on their feet. Not applauding, not. The chaos in the council chamber was unlike anything in its 300-year history. Delegates shouted at each other in 12 different languages, while translators struggled to keep up. Security guards moved nervously through the aisles, unsure whether to maintain order or simply observe. In the gallery above, young aliens from every species stood in silent witness while their elders argued below. Chairman Veltos struck his crystal gavel again and again, the sharp ringing sound cutting through the noise. Order! The council will have order. Slowly, reluctantly, the chamber quieted. But Elena could see that something fundamental had changed. The careful procedures and diplomatic protocols that had governed this place for centuries had been shattered by simple truth. The human representative will face sanctions for this breach of protocol. Veltos announced, his faceted voice cold with anger. The vote will proceed as scheduled. But Ambassador Theiss of the Zephyrians had risen from her seat, her crystal form catching the light as she moved to the speaking platform. Chairman, I request permission to change my delegation's vote. Veltos turned sharply toward her. The voting procedures are clearly established. No changes are permitted once. The procedures, this interrupted, say nothing about votes cast based on incomplete information. The human representative has presented evidence that was not included in our formal review. Justice demands that we consider it. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Theiss was one of the refugees humans had saved from Kepler 442. She had been in the camps when the council formed committees while her people starved. She had been aboard. The determination when Captain Santos chose to ram her ship rather than surrender alien children to slavers. The evidence was reviewed by appropriate committees. Veltos said stiffly. The Council does not make decisions based on emotional displays or propaganda footage. Propaganda? The voice came from the Veltar section, where Ambassador Kethvar had stood abruptly. His people were warriors by nature, and his scarred face showed the price of many battles. You call video records of human soldiers dying for my people propaganda? Elena remembered Kethvar from the files. He had been a prisoner in a hegemony labor camp when Lieutenant Chen's squad broke through the walls. Chen had personally carried Kethvar's wounded daughter to safety, then held the tunnel while the prisoners escaped. The humans freed my entire family from slavery, Kethvar continued, his voice rough with emotion. My daughter lives today because a human soldier chose to die for strangers. You want to call that propaganda? You want to punish them for saving my child? More delegates began standing, not to speak, but simply to show where they stood. Elena watched in amazement as the careful coalition against humanity began to fracture. A young collective drone stepped forward from its delegation's area. Elena recognized it from the footage, one of the wounded soldiers that human Marines had carried to safety. When it spoke, its translator carried an unusual emotion for a collective being. I was designated expendable by my own hive, the drone said. Combat loss parameters indicated my rescue was not cost-effective. The humans disagreed. Sergeant Rodriguez's squad spent 6 hours fighting through enemy lines to reach us. 3. Marines died to save beings their own command had written off as acceptable casualties. Elena saw Zixhai shifting uncomfortably in its seat. The collective had always prided itself on logical decision-making, but the young drone was asking uncomfortable questions about the logic of abandoning wounded soldiers. Perhaps, the drone continued, the humans understand something we have forgotten. Perhaps some things are more important than cost-effectiveness. Chairman Veltos was losing control of the chamber, and everyone could see it. This is highly irregular. The vote will proceed according to established procedures. But the momentum had shifted. Elena could feel it in the air, see it in the faces around her. For 3 years, the Council had heard only one side of the story. They had heard about human recklessness and emotional instability. They had heard about violations of procedure and disrespect for authority. They had not heard about the human medic who gave her own blood to save an alien child. They had not heard about the Marine who carried wounded enemies to safety. They had not heard about the ship captain who chose death over abandoning refugees. Now they were hearing those stories, and the carefully constructed case against humanity was crumbling. Ambassador Unity of the Ascended floated forward, its misty form rippling with what might have been uncertainty. The human data presents complications to our analysis. Perhaps a recess would be appropriate to review this new information. Elena almost smiled. The Ascended never admitted uncertainty about anything. Their merged consciousness was supposed to provide perfect clarity and logical judgment, but even they could not dismiss the evidence of human sacrifice for alien lives. There will be no recess, Veltos declared. The vote proceeds now. But as he spoke, Elena noticed movement in the gallery. Young aliens were leaving their seats and walking toward the chamber floor. Security guards moved to stop them, but hesitated when they realized these were not protesters or troublemakers. They were witnesses. A young Zephyrian male stepped forward, barely past adolescence by his species' standards. Honored Council, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I am Thaisala, formerly of Kepler 442. The human medic Sarah Kim saved my life when I was 7 cycles old. I was dying in the rubble of my home when she found me. Elena watched Thaisala speak with quiet courage, describing how Sarah had worked through the night to keep him alive, using techniques she improvised because no human had ever treated Zephyrian wounds before. Sarah Kim died 3 days later in another bombardment, Thaisala said. She was treating wounded civilians when the building collapsed. Her last words were asking if we had evacuated all the children. He looked directly at Ambassador Thys, his crystal eyes flashing with inner light. You want to quarantine the species that gave me life? You want to call their sacrifice a threat to galactic peace? More young aliens stepped forward, a collective drone who had been rescued from hegemony slavery, a Veltar warrior whose family had been freed by human soldiers. an ascended fragment whose individuality had been preserved when humans refused to let the collective absorb refugee populations. Each one told their story. Each one described human courage, human sacrifice, human willingness to die for strangers. The gallery had emptied now, with hundreds of young beings surrounding the council floor, bearing witness to truths their leaders wanted to ignore. Elena saw the moment when the vote count changed. It was visible in the representatives' faces, in their body language, in the way they looked at each other and then at the young aliens surrounding them. Ambassador Korvash of the Thermal Collective spoke first, his slow, rumbling voice carrying ancient dignity. Perhaps we have been too hasty in our judgment. The evidence suggests reconsideration may be warranted. The Veltar delegation withdraws its support for quarantine, Kethvar announced. We will not vote to cage the species that freed our children. The Young Collective Caucus requests immediate review of this decision, the wounded drone said. Previous analysis was based on incomplete data. Elena watched the vote count shift on the displays. 9 votes for quarantine became 8, then 7, then 6. The careful coalition was falling apart as delegates faced the reality of what they were being asked to do. Chairman Veltos tried one last time to maintain control. The established procedures clearly state, the procedures, interrupted a new voice, have failed us. Elena turned to see who had spoken and felt her breath catch. It was Ambassador Thulmagot of the Hegemony, the massive tentacled creature that had spent 3 years demanding human punishment. But Thulmagot was not speaking in support of quarantine. Its translator carried an emotion Elena had never heard from a hegemony representative before, something that might have been shame. The humans, Thulmagot said slowly, fought us because we deserved to be fought. They freed our slaves because slavery deserved to be ended. They showed mercy to our wounded because mercy is what civilized beings do. The chamber fell completely silent. A hegemony ambassador was admitting that slavery was wrong. It was unprecedented in galactic history. We called them barbarians, Thulmagot continued, because their barbarism showed us what we had become. We demanded their punishment because their virtue made our evil visible. Elena saw aliens throughout the chamber staring in shock. If the hegemony could admit error, if slavers could acknowledge the justice of their defeat, then everything else was possible. The hegemony withdraws its request for human quarantine, Thulmagot said. Instead, we formally request human assistance in reforming our labor practices. The silence stretched on for long moments. Then Chairman Veltos called for the final vote, his voice lacking its earlier certainty. The count was devastating for those who had wanted to cage humanity. Quarantine 2 votes, opposition 10 votes. But Elena barely heard the final tally. She was watching the faces in the gallery, seeing hope kindle in young alien eyes. She was watching delegates look at each other with new understanding. She was watching the beginning of something that might eventually become the galaxy they had all dreamed of building.